Pilots train for countless emergencies, memorizing procedures for fires, system failures, and bad weather. But sometimes, at 35,000 feet, a problem appears that no checklist fully explains. When that happens, training gives way to judgment, and experience becomes the final safety net. This is exactly what confronted the crew of Welling Flight 20-20, a routine Airbus A320 flight that turned into a powerful lesson about human decision-making in an automated age. On a calm April evening in Spain, an Airbus A320 prepared for a short domestic flight from Barcelona to Seville. Around 150 passengers boarded the aircraft, tourists eager to explore Andalusia, students returning home, and families traveling for personal reasons. The flight was scheduled to last just over an hour, nothing unusual, nothing dramatic. Inside the cockpit sat a three-pilot crew. The captain, a 47-year-old with more than 10,000 flight hours, was highly experienced on the Airbus A320. He knew the aircraft inside out, and that familiarity would soon prove critical. Beside him was a trainee first officer, still early in his airline career, with limited time on the A320. To balance the reduced experience level, a third pilot occupied the jump seat, a seasoned aviator with nearly 6,000 flight hours and a background as a test pilot. His role was to supervise, support, and step in if needed. Shortly before 7 p.m., Flight 20-20 pushed back from the gate at Barcelona's Terminal 1. Weather conditions were ideal, clear skies, good visibility, and light winds. The captain taxied the aircraft toward the runway, using the nose wheel tiller, then lined up for departure. Moments later, the engines roared to takeoff power, and the aircraft lifted smoothly into the Spanish sky, climbing southwest toward Seville. For the first part of the flight, everything appeared completely normal. None of the 157 people on board had any reason to suspect that this routine journey was about to test the limits of training, technology, and human judgment. As Flight 20-20 climbed higher, it settled into cruise at 35,000 feet. The cabin crew began their service, and the atmosphere on board was relaxed. The aircraft itself, however, carried a quiet history. At over 20 years old, it was one of the oldest A320s in the airline's fleet. Despite its age, it remained technologically advanced, equipped with systems designed to warn pilots of problems long before they became dangerous. One of those systems was the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor. ECAM constantly watches over the aircraft's systems and alerts pilots when something goes wrong, often providing step-by-step instructions to resolve the issue. It had revolutionized cockpit workload and safety. But even the most advanced systems have limits. 29 minutes into the flight, just after entering Madrid airspace, that limit was reached. Without warning, an amber caution light illuminated on the cockpit panel. Almost simultaneously, the captain's primary flight display went completely blank. Before the crew could fully react, the screen came back to life, but now a new ECAM message appeared. The warning indicated a failure in the nose wheel steering system. The cockpit fell silent for a moment. Nose wheel steering is critical on the ground, allowing pilots to control direction during taxi and after landing. In the air, it plays no role, but what happened after touchdown could now be unpredictable. The captain immediately recalled a note he had seen earlier in the aircraft's technical logbook. The plane had experienced nose wheel steering issues before. Engineers had addressed it, but the warning now suggested the problem was not fully resolved. What concerned the crew most was what they didn't see. ECAM offered no corrective actions, no checklist, no reset procedure that was clearly recommended. The system had identified a problem, but it did not provide a solution. The captain began searching the manuals, flipping through the quick reference handbook and flight crew operating procedures. One suggestion mentioned resetting a computer, but doing so carried risks. Resetting the wrong system at the wrong time could make the situation worse. For now, the captain chose caution. They had a decision to make: continue to Seville or turn back. The aircraft was flying normally, and Seville was already close. After weighing the options, the captain chose to continue, unaware that this warning was only the beginning. As the aircraft continued towards Seville, the captain reassessed the cockpit dynamic. With an abnormal situation developing, this was no longer a training flight. He asked the third pilot to return from the cabin and take the jump seat. The trainee first officer stepped back, allowing the more experienced pilot to assist directly. It was a quiet but important shift. Experience now mattered more than instruction. The backup pilot immediately began reviewing the aircraft's manuals, including the minimum equipment list and operating procedures. His background as a test pilot gave him a deeper understanding of rare failures, and he knew that nose-wheel steering malfunctions could behave in unexpected ways. Meanwhile, the captain informed the airline's maintenance control that the aircraft would likely need attention upon arrival. At that moment, he still believed the issue might be manageable on the ground. But as the discussion continued, a troubling realization surfaced. On the Airbus A320, a complete nose-wheel steering failure triggers a very unusual design response. Instead of staying centered, the nose wheel can rotate fully to one side up to 90 degrees and remain locked there. This design prevents uncontrolled movement, but it also creates serious challenges during landing. A sideways wheel cannot roll normally. If it contacts the runway at speed, friction can rapidly destroy the tire. If the rubber wears away completely, metal can scrape against asphalt, generating sparks and potentially igniting a fire. There was also the risk that the excessive sideways force could cause the nose gear to collapse entirely. The manuals offered no comforting answers. There was no procedure to realign the wheel. No way to override the system. If the wheel had indeed turned sideways, the crew would have to land with it in that position. The pilots began planning for the arrival. Runway 27 in Seville was long enough, and weather conditions were favorable, though a light crosswind blew from the left. The captain briefed the senior cabin crew member, explaining that there was an issue with the nose landing gear. He emphasized that the landing should remain controlled, but preparations for an abnormal arrival were necessary. As Flight 2020 started its descent, the tension in the cockpit grew. What they didn't yet know was whether the warning was a sensor error or a genuine mechanical failure waiting to reveal itself. During the descent towards Seville, the crew contacted air traffic control and declared a pan-pan, signaling an urgent situation without immediate danger. The captain explained that nose-wheel steering might not function after landing and that the aircraft could become stuck on the runway. With only one runway available, the airport began holding arriving and departing traffic. At this stage, the situation still felt manageable. The aircraft was flying normally, and there were no signs of structural damage. The crew's main concern remained what would happen after touchdown. The captain informed maintenance control again, emphasizing that the issue could be more serious than initially expected. As the aircraft lined up for runway 27, the pilots prepared for a standard landing. The landing gear was selected down, and moments later, 3 green lights confirmed that all gear was locked. This was reassuring, but the relief was short-lived. When the flaps were extended further, multiple systems disengaged almost at once. The autopilot disconnected. Then the flight directors vanished from the displays. Seconds later, the auto-thrust system dropped offline. The captain was suddenly flying manually, with several layers of automation gone. An ECAM warning followed, indicating an abnormal condition in the nose gear shock absorber. The aircraft believed weight was already on the nose wheel, even though they were still in the air. This false signal confirmed that something was seriously wrong with the nose gear system. Attempts to re-engage the autopilot failed. At that moment, the backup pilot remembered a famous incident from years earlier, a JetBlue A320 that landed with its nose wheel rotated sideways, broadcast live on television. The similarities were impossible to ignore. The crew needed confirmation. They requested permission to perform a low pass over the runway at just 100 feet. This would allow the control tower to visually inspect the nose wheel. The captain slowed the aircraft and leveled off above the runway, flying past the tower in an airy, silent glide. Seconds later, the answer came. The controller confirmed the crew's fear. The nose wheel was turned full 90 degrees to the side. Flight 20-20 was now facing a true emergency. After passing over the runway, the captain smoothly advanced the thrust and climbed away, bringing the aircraft up to 2,000 feet. What had started as an abnormal situation was now undeniably critical. With confirmation that the nose wheel was fully rotated, there would be no normal landing. The crew needed time to think, plan, and prepare everyone on board. The published missed approach procedure required a turn to the north, but weather complicated that option. Storm clouds were developing in that direction, adding unnecessary risk. The crew requested an alternate routing, turning south instead. Air traffic control approved the request, and Flight 20-20 climbed to 3,500 feet, circling outside the city while the pilots discussed their next move. The risks were now clear. A sideways nose wheel could shred the tire in seconds. If metal rims contacted the runway, sparks could ignite fuel vapors or hydraulic fluid. There was also the possibility that the nose gear might collapse under the unusual stress, sending the aircraft sliding along the runway. Recognizing the increased danger, the captain upgraded the emergency call. The pan was replaced with a mayday, signaling an immediate threat to life and aircraft. Fire and rescue services were requested to stand by in full force. The crew also asked whether the runway could be covered with foam to reduce fire risk. Air traffic control said they would check. Next, the captain briefed the cabin crew again. Handing control to the first officer, he called the senior flight attendant to the cockpit. He explained that the situation was more serious than initially thought and that an evacuation might be necessary after landing. Clear commands were agreed upon, preparation calls 2 minutes before touchdown, and brace commands 1 minute before impact. The cabin crew returned to the passengers, calmly but firmly preparing them for an emergency landing. Inside the cockpit, the pilots now faced their hardest task. There would be no second chances. With the emergency fully declared, the cockpit shifted into pure problem-solving mode. The first officer made an announcement to the passengers, explaining that the aircraft would be making an emergency landing in Seville and that everyone must follow the cabin crew's instructions carefully. Fear was present, but clarity helped keep panic under control. The captain focused on landing strategy. He decided against using auto brake, choosing manual braking instead to maintain precise control over deceleration. He also planned to deploy maximum reverse thrust immediately after touchdown. Slowing the aircraft as quickly as possible was critical, especially considering a previous A320 incident where nearly the entire runway had been used. The crew reviewed the available checklists. One procedure advised holding the nose off the runway as long as possible, minimizing friction and fire risk. Another checklist, intended for a different failure, suggested lowering the nose earlier while control was still available. Under pressure, the pilots debated which guidance made more sense for their unique situation. They also discussed engine shutdown. One checklist recommended shutting down the engines before the nose wheel touched the ground. The captain strongly disagreed. He wanted reverse thrust available for as long as possible and needed differential thrust in case rudder steering became ineffective. Eventually, they reached a compromise. Engines would stay running until the nose wheel contacted the runway, then be shut down. Air traffic control responded with disappointing news. Foam would not be available on the runway. Although the crew believed foam might reduce fire risk, they accepted the situation and continued preparations. Another concern emerged: fuel. With the landing gear extended, fuel burn had increased dramatically. The flight management system could not accurately predict remaining endurance under these conditions. This added pressure to land successfully. On the first attempt, finally, confirmation arrived. Fire crews were in position. The cabin was secure. There was nothing left to delay the inevitable. The captain took the controls once more and turned the aircraft toward runway 27 for the final time. As Flight 20-20 aligned with runway 27, the approach felt deceptively normal. The aircraft responded smoothly, the engines stable, the controls precise. Inside the cockpit, however, every pilot knew that the real test would come only after touchdown. The memory of past accidents weighed heavily on their minds. The fire trucks were already positioned along the runway, lights flashing, crews ready for immediate action. Other inbound flights had been diverted to nearby airports, and departures were halted. All attention was focused on a single Airbus descending toward Seville. At 400 feet, the automated callouts began counting down. The captain maintained a steady glide, resisting the urge to rush. The first officer monitored speed and descent, while the backup pilot scanned for any last-minute anomalies. 2 minutes before landing, the captain made the agreed call: finish preparation. In the cabin, flight attendants took their seats. 1 minute later, the command everyone feared followed: brace, brace. The cabin crew repeated it loudly as passengers leaned forward, heads down, waiting. 30, 20, 10. The main landing gear touched the runway smoothly. Spoilers deployed instantly, dumping lift and pressing the aircraft firmly onto the asphalt. Without hesitation, the captain applied maximum reverse thrust. The engines roared as the aircraft began to decelerate aggressively. The nose remained held high as long as possible. Every second mattered. As speed bled off, the captain carefully eased the nose downward. At around 90 knots, the nose wheel finally made contact with the runway. Almost immediately, the sideways tire began to disintegrate. Rubber tore away under extreme friction. Moments later, the tire burst. The cockpit filled with the sharp smell of burning rubber. But the aircraft remained stable. It stayed aligned with the runway. The deceleration was working. Now there was only one question left: could they stop before something worse happened? The captain kept full reverse thrust engaged, carefully managing manual braking as the aircraft slowed through 70 knots, then 50. The violent forces acting on the nose gear were unmistakable, but the aircraft held its line. There was no sudden pull, no loss of directional control, only the relentless vibration of metal and damaged rubber grinding against the runway. As the speed dropped below 30 knots, the risk of fire decreased significantly. At that point, the captain shut down both engines. The cockpit instruments dimmed, then went dark as electrical power was lost. The aircraft rolled to a complete stop well before the end of the runway. Silence followed. The pilots immediately contacted the control tower and fire crews, asking the question that mattered most: was there any fire? Within seconds, confirmation came back: there were no flames, only smoke from destroyed rubber. The worst fears had not materialized. Firefighters approached the aircraft cautiously, scanning the nose gear area for heat or sparks. Everything was under control. The danger had passed. 10 minutes later, mobile stairs were brought to the aircraft. One by one, passengers disembarked, escorted calmly back to the terminal by buses. Many were shaken, but physically unharmed. What could have been a catastrophic accident had ended with nothing more than a delayed arrival and a powerful memory. The aircraft itself remained on the runway, immobilized by the damaged nose wheel. It would take over an hour to tow it clear, forcing multiple flights to divert or cancel. But delays were a small price to pay for safety. For the crew, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by quiet reflection. Their decisions, some by the book, others driven by instinct, had brought 157 people safely back to the ground. Yet questions remained. How had this happened, and could it happen again? In the days following the incident, investigators examined the aircraft in detail. Their findings revealed a troubling chain of failures. 3 separate faults had combined to rotate the nose wheel fully sideways. One involved electrical arcing within wire bundles, traced back to inadequate maintenance practices. Another was a steering control valve that had been left in an incorrect position. The third fault, an erroneous signal from the landing gear system, could not be definitively traced to a single cause. None of these issues alone should have led to such a dangerous situation. Together, they formed a perfect storm. The investigation also revealed that this was not an isolated event. At least 18 similar A320 nose wheel rotation incidents had been recorded worldwide, each triggered by different underlying causes. The common factor was the lack of a clear, dedicated procedure for pilots to follow. The final report highlighted a critical weakness. While Airbus documentation mentioned aspects of nose gear abnormalities, it did not provide a complete, scenario-specific checklist for a locked 90-degree nose wheel. This forced pilots to rely on judgment under extreme pressure, increasing the risk of error. Investigators noted that during Flight 20-20, the crew had referenced a checklist that did not fully apply to their situation. This was not blamed on incompetence, but on stress, time pressure, and incomplete guidance. The report emphasized that even highly trained professionals are vulnerable when forced to improvise in rare emergencies. As aviation technology advances, such situations may become even more challenging. Modern pilots face fewer real-world emergencies, meaning their skills are tested mostly in simulators. While simulators are effective, they cannot fully replicate the emotional intensity of a real crisis. Flight 2020 became a case study in how humans interact with automation and what happens when automation falls silent. The incident of Welling Flight 2020 ultimately ended without injuries, but its lessons reached far beyond a single runway in Seville. Investigators recommended that Airbus develop a clear, dedicated procedure for handling irreversible nose wheel rotation failures. Pilots needed guidance they could trust, guidance that would remove uncertainty during one of the most stressful moments imaginable. The event also highlighted a growing paradox in aviation. Aircraft have become safer and more automated than ever before, yet this very reliability means pilots encounter fewer real emergencies throughout their careers. When something truly abnormal occurs, they must perform flawlessly in situations they may have only practiced in simulators. Human judgment, under intense pressure, becomes both the strongest asset and the greatest vulnerability. On Flight 2020, experience made the difference. The captain's decision to use maximum reverse thrust, manual braking, and delayed engine shutdown helped bring the aircraft to a stop before damage escalated. At the same time, the incident showed how easily even skilled crews can be drawn toward imperfect solutions when documentation is incomplete. For the passengers, the flight became a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. For the crew, it was a reminder that behind every automated system stands a human who must be ready when technology reaches its limits. Flight 2020 never crashed. But it came close enough to remind the aviation world of a timeless truth. In the end, safety still depends on people thinking clearly when everything is on the line.